So you have a lead that's a tenant occupied property. What now? We get asked this question all the time. Can you wholesale a tenant occupied property? And sometimes this surprises me. So I have to think back and I have to remember why at one point I had these same questions. And so I typically tend to think of a time that as an agent, before I really knew what it was to run numbers on a buy and hold, before we were investing, in buy and holds, much as single family homes, especially, um, what it was like. And typically speaking, my level of exposure to a tenant occupied property was properties that were listed on the MLS for full retail market value. And at the end of the day, they just did not comp out to that price point in the market as the owner occupied properties were. So you have less updates, maybe. You have a tenant living in there, so it's definitely not like staged and in the same condition. You might have deferred maintenance, you might have issues scheduling showings, things like that. And they're probably listed a little bit high. This was a lot of the experience that I had exposure to tenant occupied properties and why they might have higher days on market or why they might have difficulties selling these properties for that retail value. And that was simply because they weren't looking at it through their end buyer's eyes. So, can you wholesale these properties? Absolutely. In fact, I find this is typically easier to navigate than dealing with on market, because you're not looking at an end buyer that is an owner occupant. Typically speaking, the most difficult way to sell a property, wholesale a property, or buy even a property that is tenant occupied is when it's at full market value, right? It's not an investor looking at it for an investment. A lot of times investors look at those deals and they're like, I need it at a lower price. I understand the home could be valued here, but I'm going to have to look at this because of the situation. I'm going to have to look at this as a buy and hold for myself. It is an investment. So I'm not willing to pay this amount. In order for me to pay this amount, I would be having to be an owner occupant. So usually that kind of difficulty is what sets the precedence that this is like not a good lead. But I'm here to tell you that is a misnomer. That's a misnomer. If you only have that exposure or you kind of have those thoughts going around, you don't have exposure to dealing with a tenant occupied property, then I'm here to tell you how we navigate that situation. So, and also, I mean, again, we get this question all the time. So I guess it's time to really answer it. First and foremost, it's incredibly important that you set proper expectations with the seller, owner, landlord of the property. You do that up front. We talk about this all of the time. It is vital to having a smooth transaction, right? Setting those expectations, first and foremost, having access to communicate with the tenant, okay? You minimize so much trouble during that due diligence, during walkthroughs, etc., by just having direct access to the tenant to schedule walkthroughs. So I'll give you an example that we even ran into. We had a seller that really didn't want us to talk to the tenants. They're like, don't worry about it. Got a great relationship with them. I will manage it. Well, we set up a walkthrough and we're wholesaling the property. This is in New Jersey. The buyer has to drive 2 hours to get to the property. We check, and double check with the seller tenant's going to be there, tenant's going to be there, tenant's going to be there. Buyer shows up, tenant's not there. And seller contacts tenant. They say, oh my gosh, forgot I had an appointment and we're not going to be back until 5 hours. Buyer's livid. Now, had we not been playing the telephone game, we could have minimized that blow up that happened because a lot of time was wasted. So how do we do this? We explain that type of situation to them. We explain to them, we are going to try to condense showings as much as possible. We're going to try to condense walkthroughs as much as possible. But inevitably, if we do not have contact with that tenant, first and foremost, we're going to want to be able to vet the tenant out to a certain degree, right? Just having a good conversation with them. You want to know everything that you can get from the seller when it comes to the deal in and of itself. But if sellers are trying to hide the tenant from you, it's usually one of two reasons. The tenant's crazy, or the seller is scared that you're going to spook their tenant. Okay. So you've got to reassure them that you're going to handle the conversation with the tenant in a certain way. You're not going to scare them off or anything like that. Now, what does that come down to? You really just are not going to jeopardize that tenant-landlord relationship whatsoever. You, as a buyer or a wholesaler, are not going to be taking over anything, and you really have no right to talk anything to that tenant until you own that property. So it's very important that you don't do anything to jeopardize that relationship. You don't talk numbers, you don't talk raising rents, you don't talk anything like that. You tell your buyers this. You talk to the landlord about this. You talk to the seller about this. It's just vitally important that you set those expectations up front. You're just going to help coordinate, any access needed during due diligence period. It's very important in not ending up having missed scheduled appointments. I mean, not only that, but if you're trying to condense showings, you're trying to condense the need for access during due diligence, then you're going to try to be lining up multiple people in a smaller time block, right? And so at the end of the day, you have to have that exposure to the tenant, but ensuring the seller you're not there to jeopardize anything. And, any questions that the tenant has, if they have any concerns, you'll absolutely tell them, hey, refer to Mr. or Mrs. Seller. They should put your mind at ease here. We're just making sure that we're able to do this walkthrough inspection, et cetera, et cetera. So number one, setting up those expectations with the seller, getting access to that tenant. And I'm not even opposed to, that seller being included in, showings, letting them be aware when it's happening. So they're not setting up the communication directly to that tenant, but that you're not running into that situation where you have that telephone game, you have too many people involved, and that leaves room for things to fall through the cracks. So what we call recon, which is getting that initial walkthrough, getting photos, understanding what the property condition is, if there's any deferred maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times what we'll do in an occupied property, not even just a tenant occupied property, so we have a checklist, right? And so we will often send that checklist to that tenant and say, hey, to help us minimize the amount of times we need access to the property, if you take photos like this and send them or drop them into this folder, send them a G Drive link, it will help us eliminate an initial walkthrough. So you're not having to schedule as much, and we're trying to just minimize, any amount of having to schedule it with you and putting you out of place, or you can do this on your time frame if you can get this done for us in the next 24, 48 hours, right? So that really helps a lot on occupied properties in that they're at least a little bit tech savvy in order to send you those photos. So we do that all of the time so that, if we're wholesaling the property, we're able to say, hey, this is a set of expectations we have. A lot of times on tenant occupied properties, that actual seller / landlord hasn't even been in the property for a while, right? So that kind of helps eliminate one walkthrough, condense amount of showings, makes the process a lot simpler, easier, etc. For the walkthroughs, we very much explain we have to do our due diligence. We have to do planning and build proof for our funding on that, in that we're buying like while our inspections are not like formal inspections, they still have to be, we have to put together a burden of proof, right? We have to make sure there's not like, again, that deferred maintenance. We have to plan for expenses. A tenant occupied property doesn't always mean that it's going to stay tenant occupied. So that could be for a flip. We have to put together a whole rehab budget. And it could just be for upcoming expenses, even as a hold. Either way, that's important to put together, again, the plan for the exit. It's an investment. That doesn't mean we don't have to do due diligence and planning, etc., or we don't need to see the property, right? Most people realize that and understand that very well, but there are people out there who think, well, you could just buy it sight unseen and I'm going to have, give a cash offer. In which we respond to them, if that's the case, we need an extremely discounted rate, which means we're not going to be able to pay you as much as we could if you allow us due diligence. If that's the case, my offer changes to this. And most of the time, they become very compliant. We're doing the work anyways, right? So this is also super important, guys. Like if the tenant is not going to be there, more often than not, like that tenant is going to help you to set up that access so that you have access to do that due diligence. Sometimes what that looks like is they may leave a key with a friend, a neighbor. They may leave a lockbox, and they may just say like, hey, I'll be there at 4 p.m. every day during the week. And if you need walkthroughs by any stretch of the imagination, just let me know. Make sure that while you guys are setting these expectations, while you're communicating, while you're understanding how you're going to easily navigate this situation, that you are informing all parties. They have to be on time and they all know, hey, a walkthrough is going down at this time. It'll take about 15 to 30 minutes to do this walkthrough. When people realize it's not going to be like this big overbearing chunk of like 2-hour inspection where, they're running snakes down pipes, a lot of times you're eliminating those concerns just by talking to them about how it's going to go, right? Things that you really also need to know to help expedite this process. Let's just call it expedite this process. You want to be extremely effective and you want to be extremely efficient, okay? And I see a lot of people who even are, locking up tenant occupied contracts, asking us to JV with them. They're not telling us what the current rent rate is. They're not even asking. Maybe they are looking at market rent. Maybe they're just looking at, who knows? But sometimes we don't even get that information, which blows my mind. You need to get the current rent rate. You need to figure out what the market rent rate is. Ask how long the tenant has been there. You need to consider what any deferred maintenance or updates might be needed so you can value the property properly. That's a tongue twister. You need to understand if they're on a long-term lease or if they're month to month. Are they planning on staying? If they are month to month and they just didn't get a renewed lease because the seller is planning to sell and they wanted to make sure that the new buyer has the opportunity to choose whether to buy and hold, whether to occupy, or whether to, flip the property as an investment there. And does the rent rate, this is a big kicker that people always forget to ask, does the rent rate include utilities or HOAs, right? So if there's like a chunk on HOA, this happens a lot of times in like condos, like it massively impacts where you need to be on the property, because if you're buying and holding it, you want it to cash flow, right? And sometimes that HOA fee can kill the cash flow. And the same thing can happen when a landlord has agreed to pay utilities. It can totally kill the cash flow and, by hundreds of dollars a month. And so you need it at a different price. The other big thing is deposits. If they collect a deposit, you want to also let them know, hey, I need a copy of the lease, just so that I can plan appropriately what I can do with this property once I am the owner. And this is just totally normal. The last thing is just understanding that rent is going to be prorated. If you don't close on the last day of the month, or depending on when the rent is due, making sure that prorated rent is dealt with at closing and with title as well as that deposit, pretty big deal. Letting the seller know that you're going to need a copy of the lease, contact information. You actually want to connect. You don't want to actually go to the tenant for that information. You want to go to the landlord for that information. Okay. Just again, really understanding what that tenant's plan is after closing. You really kind of don't even want to get that from the tenant if you don't have to. You don't want to talk about too much to the tenant until you're owning it. So I'll just give you guys a final example of a situation gone wrong here, on the other end of this, right? So we had 2 single family homes side by side several years ago. I can't even remember how long ago it was, but it's been a minute. And we purchased them as they were buy and holds, they were tenant occupied, and we purchased them, and they needed some updating, but they were pretty clean. And we, in essence, both of the tenants were month to month. We did our walkthrough. We go through the property. Tenants are super nice. And, we just tell them, the landlord, the owner, the seller had told them, I'm looking to sell the properties. Okay. And so they knew we were potentially going to be the buyer. So we had contracted with the seller already, and we were just doing our internal walkthrough inspection. And so we walked through, we said, okay, everything's good. We put our plan together. We get ready for closing. We get all of this information from the seller. We are, a few days away from closing. We had already previously discussed with notifying the tenants, right? Now, he didn't really want to notify the tenants that we were not planning to keep them as tenants long term, because he didn't want to do that before closing. But that's not what he told us. So we close on the property. We inform them. We now start talking to the tenants because we own it. And we talk to them and we say, hey, we've closed on the property, blah, 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 blah. You know, as you know, we're not planning to keep these as rental properties. We're planning on doing work to them and listing them on the market. And both of the tenants were in shock. The seller had actually told them we would be keeping them as tenants and we would be keeping the rent rate the same. Rent rate was under market value, which was fine for him because he owed nothing on the properties. Not fine for us because we now have a note on the property. So these tenants are very upset, and we talked to the seller, and they're like, they basically just say, yeah, I didn't want to. I didn't want to inform them. And I'm like, great. And so we serve a formal notice. We tell the tenants, hey, we can work with you to a certain degree, but we would end up eventually having to extend. We did not take out a long-term loan for these. We would have to extend that loan, and your rent would have to cover this. I am extremely sorry, but we basically now took over whatever agreement you had, which was a month-to-month agreement, and we now only have to give you this amount of notice. So we are going to serve you this notice so that we have it on record, and then we can come up with an agreement on how long you are going to need in order to move. One of the tenants was like, I totally understand. It's fine. If you give me 40 days, I'll be good, something like that. And we're like, okay, like, let us know if you need us to work with you. He was like, not really. I got it. Blah, 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 blah. Now, the other tenants were not happy about it. And I give you guys this example because this was extremely unfortunate. They wanted to purchase a home when they moved from this rent house. And so we said, okay, you know, we've just got to figure out, you know, how long you're going to need. And is there an option for you to move into temporary housing? And if that's not an option, unfortunately, we are going to have to raise to cover everything, the amount that you're going to be paying every month. It's really unfortunate, but we can't spend money to continue to let you live in here. And I'm very sorry that you weren't given more notice. We are happy to extend it, but there's no way that we can keep collecting the same amount that you had been previously paying. Like, there's just not. We'll do what we can with you, but we were not able to speak to you about this until we were technically the owners. And there was just nothing that we could do to make these people okay with it. You know, every solution that we offered them, it was, we're basically heartless pieces of shit. You know, whether it was, do you have a family member? Because they had no money saved up to buy a house, but they wanted to buy a house. They had no idea where to look for a house, but they wanted to buy a house. They didn't want to move into another rent house, but they didn't want to pay more rent. And it's like, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know how I am the piece of crap in this scenario, but unfortunately for you, your previous landlord did not care about whatever your situation was going to be. They sold the property. They sold it, as is their right, at this price. You are not on a lease. We have no choice. We're not going to be able to pay month over month over month. You know, the best that we can do for you is offer to help. We offered, I think, in the end, to help cover some of their moving expenses, because she was losing her mind, cursing me out, like telling, all this crazy stuff. And the reality of the situation is, I just told her, I was like, I mean, you really have my sympathy in this situation. You really do. But, we've got families that rely on us too. I'm willing to work with you as much as I possibly can. I'm very sorry. It's unfortunate. Well, this woman ended up going and leaving a bad review on my Google for my agency, which dealt nothing with us. It was the owner who bought a property, but said all this stuff like, we don't care about people and we're just out here to steal from people and, blah, 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 all this crazy stuff. And it's like, man, I don't know what to tell you other than you do run into some crazy situations, and having a good relationship, explaining things to your seller properly, explaining things to your buyers and the tenants and in and of themselves cannot always avoid these scenarios, but that is a very small percentage of the tenant occupied properties that we've dealt with. Those types of horror stories are not the majority. It's like a couple percent max, and God knows how many hundreds or thousands, I don't even know how many were tenant occupied, of deals that we've been a part of. And that realistically comes from setting really good expectations. The only thing like you can't avoid is just when people don't do what they say they're going to do. More often than not, your sellers aren't going to do that to the tenants or their buyer, right? It was pretty shocking. It was pretty shocking that seller actually did that. Like, because he lied to us, like straight up lied to us about it and put us in a tough situation, put that tenant in a tough situation. And I felt for that tenant, even though she was a nightmare to deal with. And we're talking like this woman was like texting me in all hours of the night, right? But here's the deal, guys. Your buyers know that what they're dealing with when they're buying and holding properties. They know that they're buying properties, they're going to have to deal with tenants, and sometimes even the seemingly good tenants turn out to be a real pain in the butt. It happens, right? But that's the exception, not the rule. So at the end of the day, yeah, we've got a handful of nightmare tenant stories, and you just have to mitigate against that. And so if you have a lead that is tenant occupied, that doesn't mean you can't mitigate against, the recon process, the showing process, the walkthrough process, the, access, the communications between tenant and landlord, and have a smooth closing. It's just like everything else. You're solving problems for people. You're taking everybody's everything into consideration. And then you just have an amount of certain things that you've got to make sure that you have information on, getting the leases and all of that information that I covered. Understanding, obviously, it always goes back to the numbers, but assuming that you've already run the numbers, run them correctly, gathering all that information so that people can feel secure, and then understanding, what they're signing up for beyond the actual closing, beyond the actual contract, beyond the actual numbers. What is the situation with the property? What is the situation with the tenant? And setting it up so that everybody has just a smooth process. If you're versed in how to do this and you talk to your sellers and your buyers and those tenants correctly, you can do deals, and great deals. Banger deals. People are walking away from banger deals because they're tenant occupied and they don't know how to navigate these situations all of the time. So inform yourself and understand that it's absolutely possible to navigate these types of deals and get them to the closing table. Don't freeze up. Don't walk away from them just because they're tenant occupied.